My name is Beverly. I am 65 years old, and my occupation is a retired head nurse. I opened the doors of my beautiful Charlotte home to help my struggling son and his new wife, only for her to boldly claim my master bedroom and banish me to a lumpy sofa. But instead of crying or raising my voice, I just smiled, picked up my phone, and made one single call that left them standing on the curb with absolutely nothing. For 40 grueling years, I walked the hospital halls until my feet went numb. I worked brutal night shifts, held the hands of the sick, and saved every single penny I ever earned. I poured my sweat and my soul into paying off the mortgage on my gorgeous classic home in North Carolina. I sacrificed my youth so my son Jamal could go to the best schools and grow into a fine, respectable man. I took immense pride in providing for my family and building a safe haven with my own 2 bare hands. Jamal had recently married a young woman named Chloe. She always seemed to have very expensive tastes and a sense of entitlement that rubbed me the wrong way, but I kept my peace for my son. A couple of weeks ago, Jamal called me sounding incredibly stressed. He told me they were going through a severe but temporary financial crisis. He begged me to let them move in for a short while so they could catch their breath and save some money. My motherly instincts took over completely. I prepared the guest room, cooked their favorite meals, and welcomed them with a heart full of love. But that love was thrown right back in my face. The true nightmare began during their second week in my house. I had just returned from a long morning at the supermarket. My arms were aching from carrying the heavy grocery bags up the front steps. I unlocked the front door and walked down the hallway, only to stop completely frozen in my tracks. All of my personal belongings were scattered across the floor. My carefully hung dresses, my precious family photo albums, and the handmade quilts my grandmother passed down to me were tossed out like garbage. Standing right in the doorway of my master bedroom was Chloe. She had her arms tightly crossed over her chest and a chilling, smug smile plastered across her face. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and said that a woman my age simply did not need so much space. She casually pointed down the hall and told me to go make myself comfortable on the old living room couch. She declared that the master suite belonged to her and Jamal, now as if she held the deed to the house I had bled for. The shock hit me so hard my vision blurred. I looked past her shoulder and saw Jamal sitting on my bed, staring down at the floor, too much of a coward to even meet his own mother's eyes. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Most women would have dropped their groceries and started screaming. Most would have broken down sobbing at the sheer cruelty of it all. But I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at the two of them, absorbing the absolute disrespect, and chose a cold, heavy silence. The physical pain of sleeping on that lumpy floral couch was absolutely nothing compared to the agony of watching my own home be stripped of its soul. Every morning I woke up with my back screaming in protest, rubbing the deep stiffness from my neck as the early sunlight crept through the living room blinds. I had spent 40 years with Peggy's, working brutal hospital shifts, saving every single dollar I could to pay for this beautiful house, and now I was being treated like an unwanted squatter in my own sanctuary. Chloe did not just take my master bedroom. She went on a ruthless rampage to erase my entire existence from the property. I came home from a doctor appointment one afternoon to find heavy black trash bags piled up on the curb. My heart dropped heavily into my stomach when I looked inside. She had thrown away the beautiful hand-carved wooden clock my late husband gave me for our 20th anniversary. She tossed out the framed photographs of our family vacations and the vintage lamps I had carefully collected over the years. In their place, she bought these soulless, gaudy modern art pieces and cold glass tables that made my warm southern home look like a sterile hotel lobby. When I confronted Jamal about it, my strong, college-educated son could not even look his own mother in the eye. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, shifting his weight nervously. He muttered that Chloe was just going through a lot of stress, adjusting to the new living arrangement. He actually had the nerve to ask me to just be the bigger person and bear with her for a little while longer. Bear with her. I was sleeping on a sofa with broken springs, while my daughter-in-law threw my memories into a dumpster and my son was asking me to be accommodating. I swallowed the lump of absolute rage forming in my throat and nodded. I knew that arguing with a coward was a complete waste of breath. The disrespect quickly escalated from my living arrangements to my cooking and my daily habits. I have always expressed my deep love for my family through food. One Sunday, I spent hours in the kitchen preparing a beautiful spread of smothered chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and my famous collard greens. I set the dining table perfectly, hoping we could at least share a peaceful meal together. Chloe walked into the dining room, took one look at the table and dramatically pinched her nose. She sneered and called my cooking greasy peasant food. She mocked my frugality, laughing at how I still clipped grocery coupons despite having a paid-off house. She told Jamal she absolutely refused to eat a meal that would clog her arteries and ordered him to buy them expensive sushi instead. They ate their overpriced raw fish right in front of me, while my beautiful homemade dinner sat getting completely cold. But her calculated cruelty did not stop at the dinner table. A few days later, I was walking toward the master bathroom to take a hot shower to soothe my aching back. Chloe physically blocked the hallway. She told me the master bath was completely off limits to me now. She claimed I was leaving a mess, and that my cheap drugstore soaps were ruining the elegant aesthetic she was trying to create for her new lifestyle. She ordered me to use the tiny half bath near the laundry room, the one that barely had enough hot water to last 5 minutes. She looked me up and down and muttered that my entire presence in the house was an eyesore, bringing down the property value. As if losing my bedroom and my dignity was not enough, Chloe decided to invite a new parasite into my home. Without asking me, or even giving me a single warning, she moved her older brother Bradley right into my beautiful guest room. Bradley was a lazy, entitled white man who had absolutely nothing going for him except a mountain of gambling debts and a horrible, arrogant attitude. From the very moment he dragged his dirty duffel bags through my front door, he treated me like I was his personal maid. He would walk through my spotless living room with muddy boots and smoke his foul-smelling cigars right on my expensive living room rugs. The disgusting smell of cheap tobacco seeped into my curtains and made me physically sick to my stomach. I caught him more than once snooping through the private mail on the kitchen counter and opening the drawers in my hallway console. Whenever I walked into a room, Bradley would look at me with this heavy, contemptuous glare, completely dismissing my presence as if I were just the hired help. He demanded I make him fresh coffee in the mornings and complained loudly if I did not leave his laundry folded neatly on his bed. My son said absolutely nothing. Jamal watched his wife and his white brother-in-law completely take over my home and treat his 65-year-old mother like absolute dirt. They stripped away my comfort, mocked my hard work, and invaded my private space. But they severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I did not complain, and I did not shed any tears. I simply sat back and watched their every single move, silently preparing for the day they would regret ever crossing me. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when the final veil of deception was violently ripped from my eyes. I was out in the backyard, kneeling in the damp, dark soil, tending to the beautiful hydrangeas I had planted the exact same year I finally paid off the mortgage on my home. The kitchen window was cracked open just a few inches to let in the heavy North Carolina breeze. That warm, humid air carried the distinct sound of voices drifting from my kitchen table straight to my ears. I paused my trowel hovering frozen over the dirt when I recognized the harsh, grating laugh of Bradley, followed by Chloe's sharp and calculating tone. They thought I was across town at the pharmacy, picking up a prescription, But my appointment had been cancelled at the last minute. I stayed perfectly still, hidden securely beneath the thick shade of the grand oak tree, and listened in absolute silence as my own flesh and blood plotted my total destruction. Bradley was speaking loudly with his mouth full of my food, asking Chloe what they were going to do with all the cash from the luxury condo they had just sold. My heart skipped a heavy beat. They had never been facing a financial crisis. They had not been threatened with eviction. They had not lost a single dime. The entire heartbreaking story of their financial ruin was a meticulously crafted, bold-faced lie designed solely to get their foot through my front door. Chloe laughed a sound so wicked and triumphant it made my stomach physically churn, and bragged to her brother about how incredibly easy it had been to fool the sentimental old woman. She told Bradley that the massive payout from their condo sale was sitting safely in a hidden offshore account, while they lived completely rent-free under my roof, eating my food and using my utilities. But that was not even the worst part. The true, paralyzing horror washed over me when Chloe lowered her voice and started discussing my medical records. She told Bradley and Jamal that she had found a shady physician across the state line who was willing to look the other way for a generous cash bribe. They were actively forging complex medical documents to officially state that I was suffering from rapid, early-onset dementia. Chloe laid out the entire blueprint of her master plan with chilling precision. She said they just needed my signature on a few key legal papers to grant them full, uncontested power of attorney over my life. Once they had legal control, they were going to legally evict me from my own home and dump me into a severely underfunded state-run psychiatric ward on the far edge of the county. They planned to completely liquidate all my retirement assets, transfer the deed of my beloved Charlotte home directly into Chloe's name, and live like absolute royalty on the fortune I had spent 40 grueling years building. And my son, the boy I had carried in my womb, fed with my own sweat, and clothed with my own tears, simply cleared his throat and agreed with her. Jamal murmured that it was the most practical solution, that I was getting too old to really enjoy the money anyway, and that he desperately needed my home equity to start his own consulting firm. He traded his mother's freedom for a down payment on a business venture. I did not gasp. I did not drop my gardening tools or burst into uncontrollable tears. Decades of working as a head trauma nurse had trained me to keep my head entirely clear during a massive emergency. I slowly wiped the dark soil from my calloused hands, feeling a terrifying, icy calm wash over my entire body. The initial shock evaporated into the humid air, leaving behind a pure, refined determination. They thought they were dealing with a frail, oblivious old lady who would just roll over and surrender. They had absolutely no idea they had just awakened a seasoned survivor. That very evening, Chloe decided to execute the final dramatic phase of her cruel little performance. Without asking for my permission or even giving me a heads up, she invited a dozen of her pretentious, wealthy friends over for an extravagant dinner party right in my dining room. They drank my expensive vintage wines, ate off the fine china I had saved for special occasions, and laughed loudly while I sat quietly on the lumpy living room sofa they had banished me to. I watched them in total silence, my hands folded neatly in my lap, observing the predators circling their prey. Halfway through the evening, the loud jazz music suddenly stopped. Chloe stood up at the head of my dining table and gently clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The entire room fell into a dramatic, respectful hush. Chloe looked around at her captive audience, and then she locked her eyes right on me. Right before my very eyes, she transformed into an actress worthy of an Academy Award. Her eyes welled up with perfectly timed tears, and her lower lip began to tremble with fake, overwhelming sorrow. She walked over to the living room, her fancy friends following closely behind her like an audience to a tragic play, and she stood right in front of my sofa. With a voice thick with manufactured grief, Chloe announced to the entire room that her beloved mother-in-law was rapidly losing her mind. She claimed that my memory was completely deteriorating, that I was wandering the house at all hours of the night, and that just yesterday I had left the gas stove burning for hours, nearly killing us all in a tragic fire. It was an absolute vicious lie. I have never left a stove on in my entire life, but I kept my face entirely blank, revealing absolutely nothing. Chloe pulled a thick, heavy stack of legal documents from her designer handbag. She dropped to her knees in front of me, taking my warm hands in her icy, clammy fingers. She squeezed them tightly, looking up at me with those weeping, deceitful eyes, and told me that she and Jamal simply loved me too much to let me suffer any longer. She announced to the silent, pitying crowd that they had found a wonderful specialized care facility that could give me the round-the-clock supervision I so desperately needed. All I had to do, she whispered in a patronizing, sickeningly sweet tone, was sign the medical directives and the power of attorney papers she had just placed gently on my lap. It was a brilliantly evil trap designed to break me. By cornering me in front of a dozen wealthy witnesses, she had painted me into an impossible corner. If I raised my voice, yelled at her for lying, or snatched the papers away, I would instantly validate her fake narrative. I would look exactly like a belligerent, confused old woman suffering from a severe mental decline, refusing much-needed help. Her friends were already looking at me with sad, condescending eyes, whispering among themselves about the terrible tragedy of aging. They thought I was completely trapped. Chloe pressed a heavy gold pen into my right hand, urging me to just sign the dotted line so I could finally rest and be taken care of. The sheer audacity of this young woman kneeling in my own house trying to steal my entire existence, while pretending to be a loving savior, made my blood boil with a heat hotter than a Carolina summer. But I knew better than to react with raw anger. Anger is sloppy, and anger is loud. I needed to be surgically precise. I looked down at the gold pen in my hand, and then looked deeply into Chloe's fake, tear-filled eyes. I let a vacant, tired smile spread slowly across my face. I patted her cold hand, gently, acting exactly like the exhausted, defeated elder she desperately needed me to be. I told her in a soft, wavering voice that my eyes were just too tired to read such small print tonight, and I asked if I could take the papers to my room to look over them in the morning when the light was better. Chloe let out a tiny, irritated sigh, but quickly masked it with an understanding nod, completely confident that she had already broken my spirit. She backed away, smiling at her friends, completely unaware that by handing me those forged documents, she had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to absolutely destroy her. I walked slowly up the grand oak staircase of my home, taking each step with a heavy, trembling sigh, fully leaning into the performance of a broken and confused elder. I could hear Chloe downstairs in my dining room, popping open a bottle of expensive champagne, celebrating her premature victory with her brother Bradley and my cowardly son, Jamal. I closed the door to the small guest room, the cramped space they had forced me into, and the very moment the latch clicked shut, my trembling stopped completely. I stood up perfectly straight in the darkness. I did not shed a single tear of sorrow. I did not collapse onto the floor in a puddle of misery and defeat. 40 years of managing emergency trauma units had taught me exactly how to compartmentalize intense pain. You do not panic when the alarm sounds. You assess the damage, you stop the bleeding, and you take absolute control of the room. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and smoothed out the forged medical directives Chloe had so graciously handed to me. The sheer arrogance of these people truly astounded me. They honestly believed I was a helpless old fool who would just surrender my entire life to their greed. I waited patiently in the quiet dark. I listened to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick away the hours until the heavy, drunken footsteps downstairs finally faded and the house fell into a deep, alcohol-induced slumber. It was almost 3 in the morning when I quietly turned the brass handle of my door. I slipped out into the hallway, silent as a shadow in my own home, stepping carefully over the creaky floorboard under the vintage runner rug that only I knew about. The foul smell of Bradley's stale cigar smoke still lingered in the air, fueling my righteous determination with every breath I took. I made my way to the den that Jamal had arrogantly converted into his personal home office. The door was slightly ajar. He was always so incredibly careless, always assuming he was the smartest man in every room. I slipped inside and turned on the small desk lamp, keeping the light extremely low. There, scattered across his mahogany desk, was the rest of their wicked blueprint. They had left everything out in the open like amateurs. I found printed emails between Chloe and a shady, underfunded psychiatric facility located on the far edge of the county. I found bank transfer forms with my name horribly forged at the bottom. I reached into my robe pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I carefully photographed every single page, every forged signature, and every damning email. I made sure the flash was off and the focus was razor sharp, capturing the letters they had drafted to the state, claiming I was a severe danger to myself and others. Then I noticed his laptop was left open asleep, but not locked with a password. Jamal never learned how to secure his digital life. I woke the computer up and inserted a small storage drive I kept on my keychain. I swiftly downloaded their entire email history regarding my estate, creating an undeniable digital trail of their conspiracy. To seal the trap permanently, I pulled out a small digital voice recorder I had purchased weeks ago when I first suspected their deceit. I placed it securely behind a stack of heavy law books on his top shelf, setting it to voice activation mode. I knew they would be coming into this office tomorrow morning to gloat and discuss their final, cruel steps. Let them speak freely. Let them hang themselves with their own arrogant words. I meticulously wiped down the desk, making sure everything was exactly as I had found it. I crept back to my room, feeling a massive surge of power replacing every ounce of my sorrow. They wanted to play a vicious game of deception, but they were dealing with a woman who had spent decades outsmarting the Grim Reaper himself. I laid back down in that cramped bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. I was not a victim. I was the architect of their impending destruction. When the morning light finally broke through the thin curtains, I did not put on my usual comfortable house clothes. I went deep into my closet and pulled out a tailored charcoal grey suit. I pinned my hair back, perfectly applied a fresh coat of bold plum lipstick, and slipped on the vintage pearl earrings my late husband David had given me for our anniversary. I looked exactly like the formidable head nurse who used to command an entire hospital floor. I walked into the kitchen where Chloe and Bradley were drinking my expensive imported coffee. I gave them a sweet, confused smile and told them I was going out to attend a senior citizen bingo morning at the local community centre. Chloe rolled her eyes, muttered something highly derogatory under her breath to her brother, and waved me away without even looking at my face. I drove my car straight downtown to the prestigious law firm of Harrison and Associates. Lawrence Harrison has been my personal attorney and trusted confidant for over 25 years. When I walked into his immaculate office, I dropped the stack of printed photographs and the digital drive right onto his polished glass desk. I told him clearly that my son and his wife were trying to declare me legally insane, to steal my assets and throw me into a state-run ward. Lawrence looked at the forged medical documents and the emails. His face turned pale with shock and then grew incredibly dark with professional fury. He looked at me and asked how I wanted to proceed, knowing full well what I was capable of. What Jamal and his greedy, entitled wife never bothered to discover was that the beautiful house they were trying to steal was merely a fraction of my actual wealth. When my brilliant husband passed away, he left me a massive financial portfolio. He had quietly invested our savings in commercial real estate and highly profitable tech stocks for decades. I was sitting on a highly diversified, multi-million-dollar trust fund. I lived a modest, quiet life simply because I preferred it that way, not because I lacked the resources to live lavishly. I never wanted my son to become spoiled by immense wealth, so I kept the true extent of our fortune completely hidden. But the most devastating secret of all was the truth about Jamal's supposedly self-made consulting business. For the past 5 years, his company had been secretly propped up by a massive anonymous angel investor. That anonymous investor was me. I had been funneling tens of thousands of dollars into his company accounts through a blind corporate entity to keep his arrogant head above water, all because a mother always wants to see her child succeed. He paraded around town, thinking he was a brilliant, highly successful businessman. But he was nothing more than a subsidized toddler playing with a briefcase. His entire luxurious lifestyle, the luxury cars, the designer clothes Chloe constantly bought, the extravagant dinners, was entirely funded by my silent charity. I sat back in the leather guest chair and gave Lawrence my absolute final orders. I told him to immediately dissolve the corporate entity funding Jamal's business. I wanted every single financial lifeline permanently cut off before noon. The company would bleed out and collapse within days without my capital. Next, Lawrence and I drove 3 blocks over to see my oldest friend Roland, who was the senior manager at my primary bank branch. Roland and I went over all my financial accounts with a fine-tooth comb. I instructed Roland to permanently freeze all the secondary credit cards I had generously allowed Jamal and Chloe to use for emergencies. I completely removed Jamal as an authorized user on every single checking and savings account, entirely blocking his access to any of my funds. I watched Roland hit the final keystrokes on his computer, locking them out of my wealth forever. Finally, I sat back down with Lawrence in his office to draft the ultimate weapon. As the sole uncontested legal owner of the property they were currently defiling with their presence, I had Lawrence draft an immediate ironclad eviction notice. I did not want it mailed through the postal service where they could claim they never received it. I wanted it fully prepared for a dramatic, personal delivery. I spent the rest of the afternoon transferring the bulk of my liquid assets into an impenetrable offshore trust that not even the most aggressive, expensive lawyer could ever touch. I completely restructured my will, leaving absolutely everything to a charity that helps abused and abandoned senior citizens, entirely cutting Jamal out of my legacy. By the time the sun began to set over the city skyline, I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of their luxurious fake lives. They were dancing and drinking champagne in a house made of fragile paper cards, and I was standing outside holding the match. I drove back to my house feeling a profound, unshakable peace settling into my bones. The storm of the century was coming for them, and they had absolutely no idea that their reign of disrespect had just sealed their ultimate ruin. I drove back to my house, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed unfamiliar cars lining the street. The front door was wide open, and loud, pulsing music spilled out into the quiet evening air. Chloe had actually thrown a premature victory party. She invited her pretentious friends over to celebrate her brand new house, even though my signature was nowhere on those forged documents. I walked through the front door, and the sight made my blood boil, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. Waiters in crisp white shirts were passing around trays of expensive appetizers. Chloe was standing in the center of my living room, holding a glass of champagne, pointing out different walls to a group of men in work boots holding clipboards and measuring tapes. She had actually brought in contractors to measure my living room so they could tear down the walls and completely gut the place. Bradley was sprawled out on my good armchair, laughing loudly with a cigar in his hand. Jamal was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the kitchen from his own guilt. They all thought I was out at the community center, defeated and broken. They expected the frail old woman who slept on the lumpy sofa to walk through that door with her head hung low. But the woman who stepped into the foyer was not a victim. I was wearing my tailored charcoal grey suit, my vintage pearl earrings, and a fresh coat of plum lipstick. I looked every bit the formidable head trauma nurse who had run entire hospital floors with an iron fist. I walked right past the stunned waiters and stood in the center of my own living room. Chloe stopped mid-sentence, her champagne glass freezing in the air. The contractors lowered their measuring tapes, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Bradley sat up, his arrogant smirk, faltering slightly as he took in my appearance. I did not raise my voice to a shrill scream. I simply projected the heavy, commanding tone I used when a patient was coding and I needed absolute silence. I ordered the catering staff to turn off the music immediately. The loud bass cut out abruptly, leaving a deafening silence echoing off the walls. Every single eye in the room turned toward me. Chloe recovered her shock quickly, plastering on a fake, condescending smile. She took a step forward, trying to treat me like a confused patient who had wandered out of her room. She told the crowd that I was having one of my bad days, and asked me to please go back to the guest room so I would not get overwhelmed. I looked her dead in the eye, my face a mask of pure ice, and told her that the only people who were going to be overwhelmed tonight were the ones standing in my house, illegally. Jamal finally scurried out of the kitchen, his face draining of all colour when he saw me standing there like a judge, ready to pass a sentence. I smiled at my son, a cold and terrifying smile, and pulled my smartphone from my purse. I did not dial a random number. I pressed the speed dial for my attorney Lawrence. I simply told him we were ready. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak front door swung open again. Lawrence stepped inside with a thick leather briefcase, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers from the local precinct. The wealthy guests gasped and immediately started backing away toward the walls. Chloe dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering sharply against the hardwood floor. Bradley jumped up from the armchair, his face turning an ugly shade of pale. I walked over to the large glass coffee table Chloe loved so much and threw a heavy manila folder right onto the center of it. I announced that the folder contained an immediate ironclad eviction notice signed by a judge, along with irrefutable digital evidence of their conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and medical document forgery. I turned to my son, watching his arrogant facade crumble into absolute terror. I told Jamal that I had spent the entire morning at the bank and the law firm. I revealed the truth in front of his wife and all her snobby friends. I told him I had completely dissolved the blind corporate entity that had been secretly funding his failing consulting business for the past 5 years. I watched his eyes widen in pure horror as I explained that every single credit card in his wallet was now completely frozen, and his access to my accounts was permanently revoked. He was completely broke, and the entire room now knew that his wealthy, successful lifestyle was nothing but a pathetic illusion funded entirely by his mother. Chloe started to hyperventilate, screaming that I could not do this to family, that I was ruining their lives. I stepped right into her personal space, my voice steady and unwavering. I told her that the lumpy sofa in the living room was never my place. I declared that my place is right here, permanently etched on the legal deed of this house. I looked at Jamal, Chloe, and Bradley, sweeping my gaze over the 3 parasites who tried to bury me alive. I pointed a single steady finger toward the front door. I told them they had exactly 30 minutes to pack whatever clothes they could fit into their bags and get off my property before I instructed the officers to arrest them for criminal conspiracy and fraud. The absolute silence in the room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Justice was finally being served, and it tasted sweeter than anything I had ever known. Jamal collapsed to his knees right there on the hardwood floor. He grabbed my hands, sobbing heavily, begging for forgiveness, pleading with me to remember that he was my only son. But looking down at him, I felt absolutely nothing. The son I had sacrificed my entire life for died the moment he agreed to lock me in a psychiatric ward for a paycheck. I pulled my hands away and stepped back. Chloe and Bradley were frantically trying to use their phones, calling the bank, calling their credit card companies, only to hear the exact same automated message that every single account was frozen solid. The colour drained completely from Chloe's perfectly made-up face as the horrifying reality finally sank in. She had absolutely nothing. Her entire luxurious existence was gone in the blink of an eye. The police officers stood firm, ordering them to pack their bags immediately. Within 30 minutes, they were dragging their heavy designer suitcases down the front steps. My neighbours had all come out onto their porches, watching the entire humiliating scene unfold. Chloe hid her face behind her hands, completely mortified, while Bradley cursed under his breath, struggling with his bags. Jamal looked back at me one last time, his eyes pleading for a second chance, but I just closed the front door and locked it tight. They walked away into the night with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. The very next morning, I hired the best locksmith in Charlotte to change every single lock on the property. I had a state-of-the-art security system installed, complete with high-definition cameras covering every angle of my beautiful home. With the parasites finally gone, the house felt lighter, as if a thick, suffocating fog had been permanently lifted. I walked out to my back porch, holding a steaming cup of chamomile tea, and sat in my favourite rocking chair. I looked out over my blooming hydrangeas and the grand oak tree, taking a deep, uninterrupted breath of the warm Carolina air. For the first time in months, I felt absolute profound peace. Many people fear growing old alone, but in that moment the solitude was not scary at all. It was the ultimate liberation. My freedom tasted sweeter than any victory I could have ever imagined. A mother's love is unconditional, but respect must be earned by actions. Never confuse an older woman's kindness with weakness. If you liked this story, please hit like, subscribe, and let me know what city you are watching this video from and what time it is right now. Please protect the elders around you. See you next time.